Well, thank you so much to GEFI and NatWest for this opportunity. So it might seem crazy to start a conference by speaking about the end of ESG, because a world without ESG, that is a world that we would not want to live in. What does a world without ESG look like? Well, it looks like the world of Milton Friedman, where he argues that the social responsibility of business is to increase profits. What does that mean? That means focusing totally on making money and forgetting about any concerns for employees, customers, or society. We would never want to live in that world. But actually, Milton Friedman never wrote this. This was written by Steve Dennings in an article in Forbes magazine, where he claims that this is what Milton Friedman said, but nowhere in Milton Friedman's article is there the implication. And it's not just the Steve Dennings article. Many articles about Milton Friedman, they did not actually read beyond the title and actually attribute to him some inferences that he was never actually claiming. So what did Milton Friedman actually say? Well, he said it may well be in the long-run interest of a company to invest in its employees, to invest in its community. So this is why he argued that companies should only focus on profits. Because as long as you define those profits as long-term profits, a company that cares about long-term profits will invest in a diverse and inclusive workforce, it will manage its climate risks and its biodiversity risks, and it will come up with innovations to address society's challenges. So absolutely, we don't want short-term profit maximization, but in his view, what we need not necessarily is ESG, but more long-term focus on profits. For example, if you're a car company, would you invest in electric cars? Well, the answer is yes. Even if I don't care about climate change, I will invest in electric cars because there's money to be made. I would draw up a spreadsheet, I could forecast the future profits from electric cars, and if the profits are higher than the costs, then I will go ahead. So again, one might think, well, we don't need ESG, we just need to focus on profits as long as profits are long-term. Well, with this broader view of profits, then you might think, well, that's strange that I am such an advocate of ESG. And the reason for this is that profits are not something that you can maximize instrumentally. What I've highlighted is an approach where a chief executive goes into office every day and sits down and thinks, well, how can I maximize profits? And it is indeed true that there are some decisions, like the electric car factory, that you could draw up a spreadsheet and calculate the profit impact. But there are many decisions which you cannot reduce to a spreadsheet calculation, no matter how complex and sophisticated your analysis is. To give you an idea, let's step back 20 years to 2003. And let's consider the UK telecoms company Vodafone. So Vodafone noticed that in Kenya, citizens were using phones to transfer mobile minutes to each other as a form of currency. And so this gave them an idea. What if we could develop a technology that would allow people to transfer not mobile minutes to each other, but actual currency? Because at the time, 15 million Kenyan adults were unbanked, they had to rely on cash, which could be forged, it could be lost, or it could be stolen. And indeed, 4 years later, after a lot of experimentation and research and development, they launched M-Pesa, a mobile money service which allowed people to transfer money from phone to phone just as easily as you could send a text message. And so this was huge for society. It lifted 200,000 households out of poverty in the first 7 years by giving them access to finance. And many of these households were headed up by women. It allowed them to move from agriculture to business and retail, so there was a big effect on gender equality. But the coda to this story is that NatWest was able to turn this, Vodafone was able to turn this into a profit because they're now able to charge a small fraction of every transaction as a fee. But notice that that profit could never have been forecast from the outset. Would a CEO have ever been able to draw up a spreadsheet and say, well, if I develop M-Pesa, I will develop this in terms of money? No. At the time, Vodafone's strategy was to expand in the West and to win spectrum license auctions in the UK. That's where there was money to be made. So without a sense of purpose, without a sense of ESG, it may never have tried to develop something like this. What drove them was their purpose, and their purpose was to build a digital society that enhances socio-economic progress. So rather than viewing profit as something to achieve directly, it's achieved indirectly as a result of serving wider society. This is linked to some of John Kay's earlier work on obliquity. Often, if you want to achieve a goal, you don't go after it directly, but you see it as a byproduct. And so in a recent book, I took this and I drew up a framework where you think about the value that a company creates as being given by a pie. And that pie can be split between investors in the form of profits, or society in the form of fair taxes, fair wages, fair prices. That is the orange. And often a CEO thinks, well, my goal is to maximize profits, and I do that by splitting the pie differently, by taking from the orange and then increasing the blue. But there's a limit to how much you can split the pie, because you're not going to be able to increase profits beyond the existing size of the pie. Instead, well, what is the idea of ESG or purpose if instead we don't view profits as something to get directly, but as a byproduct of growing the pie, coming up with crazy ideas like banking without a bank, like developing mobile money, crazy solutions to the climate crisis and biodiversity crisis. All of these ideas are driven primarily by addressing the biggest social problems of the world. But then as a byproduct, we can then turn this into a profit. So this is why I believe that ESG is extremely important. This is not just something for somebody with ESG in their title or list of research interests. This is why it's great afterwards to have a panel with leading executives who are in the C-suite rather than with specific ESG roles. If ESG is a way of creating long-term financial value, then everybody should be concerned about it. So this is why I said in my earlier paper, ESG is extremely important. But it's also nothing special. Why? Yes, ESG is a way of creating long-term value, but there are other things that create long-term value which don't fall under the ESG bucket. So great innovation, great leadership, great capital allocation, productivity, those don't necessarily have an ESG label. But so why I wrote this End of ESG paper is if we put ESG on a pedestal above all of those other issues, then it might be we're neglecting some of the other ways to solve some of the biggest problems in the world. So let me just end by talking about 3 implications of viewing ESG as extremely important, a way of creating long-term value, but not necessarily better than other intangible assets that also create value. So one implication is in terms of engagement. So as an investor, we've got lots of senior asset managers here. Right now, you get a lot of plaudits from the clients and general public if you engage with companies on issues such as diversity and climate transition and so on, and absolutely you should engage with those issues. But there's also non-ESG issues which are also important. So if a company has poor capital allocation, is wasting a lot of money on unnecessary mergers and acquisitions or capital expenditures, if they're not being productive and innovative, those are things which are also ripe for engagement, but don't get as much plaudits right now. So rather than seeing ESG engagement as good, non-ESG engagement as bad, let's instead think about good ideas and bad ideas. There could be good ideas which are on non-ESG engagement, and there could be ESG engagements that might be bad because they might be micromanaging a company or they might be on immaterial issues. And indeed, if you take the evidence, actually there is quite a lot of evidence that non-ESG engagement doesn't just create financial value, but also social value. Because if non-ESG engagement makes a company productive and more efficient, that's not only good for shareholders, it's good in terms of reducing resource usage. And in contrast, this is a graph taken from a study by Rob Jackson, who is one of the commissioners of the Security and Exchange Commission. If you look at engagement by gadfly investors who might have a general agenda behind them rather than just long-term value, actually gadfly engagement leads to negative long-term returns. That's given by the green. Whereas engagement by dedicated investors who have skin in the game, who've done a lot of research before their engagement, that's what you see in the purple. Okay, so engagement, don't think about ESG versus non-ESG, just think about, is this idea creating long-term value? The second trend that we've seen is that with ESG, we now have this trend towards ESG metrics. Companies need to demonstrate how they're doing ESG to address this big problem of greenwashing. And I'm very sympathetic to that. Obviously, as a finance professor, I believe in the power of data. But then if we think about the other drivers of long-term value, other intangible assets like great leadership, we recognize that we can't reduce that to a simple set of metrics. Well, every investor, I'm sure, would like to invest in a company with a great leadership team, but do they have measures of this? Not necessarily. They'll look at some things like track record, but they'll look at some qualitative dimensions, such as is their skill set relevant and adequate for the 21st century firm. And so when we reduce something as complicated as ESG to a simple set of metrics, something we wouldn't do for other drivers of long-term value, you miss a lot of the action. So some of you who were in my SDG Hive presentation yesterday, diversity, equity, inclusion, that's something very complex and very important, but it's often reduced to simple demographic diversity. That doesn't capture other aspects of cognitive diversity, nor equity and inclusion. And I presented some of my new research suggesting that true DEI is linked to future performance, but a simple measure of demographic DEI is not. And the final issue is about regulation to address greenwashing. And again, I think it's really important to ensure that funds say what they do, what they say. But you might think greenwashing applies to any field. So if you're a value fund, are you truly investing in high-value companies? You might think that, as an investor, as a client, I deserve protection from a fund which claims to be a value fund, but invests in actually companies which are bad value. If I was to invest in the Capital Group New World Fund, is this truly investing in frontier economies? If I'm investing in the Jupiter Global Financial Innovation Fund, is it investing in funds that are truly financially innovative? So absolutely, investors in sustainable funds do deserve protection. Their funds should invest sustainably. But I think that protection should apply to any investor in a fund which claims to follow a certain style or theme. And in fact, any fund, any actively managed fund claims to beat the market. But if you underperform the market 5 years in a row, you're going to get far less of a media backlash than if you're a sustainable fund and you don't vote for a particular ESG shareholder proposal. And it's not clear to me why that's the case. Any client deserves protection for investing in a fund that doesn't do what it intended to do. Okay, so just to wrap up, there's further things, but let me now get to the panel. The article that this was based on is called The End of ESG. Not saying that we should end the term, I'm not an anti-ESG person, I'm saying it should end as a niche practice. This should be something which is just integrated and seen as a mainstay part of any executive or any investor's duty to understand the ESG issues of an organization. This is not necessarily just the global ethical finance initiative. This should just be about business. All business should consider these ethical principles and take them seriously, but we should not necessarily put them above all of the other drivers of long-term value within a company. Well, thank you very much again to GEFI for this opportunity to open the conference. Now I'm delighted to moderate a panel on the challenges of ESG integration. How do we put this into practice? And we're really lucky to have two leaders in this field. So I'd like to welcome Katie Murray, the Group Chief Financial Officer of NatWest Group, and Stephen Jones, the Chief Investment Officer of Aegon Asset Management, to share their perspectives. So let's give them a warm welcome to the stage. Okay, so Katie, we'll start with you. So at NatWest, could you talk about the risk that climate poses to your balance sheet, and how do you go about managing and addressing those risks?
Yeah, no, sure. First of all, it's lovely to be here. Oh, I can see my first rule. Is that working? Yeah, it is perfect. So it's lovely to be here this morning. It's lovely to see the auditorium so full as well. I spend a lot of my time standing on this stage, and it's good to have a slightly different audience than my finance team, lovely as they are, to talk to as well. So thank you very much for making the time. Look, climate, this is sort of stating the obvious. You know, we know it's a risk to all of us. It's a risk to our balance sheet. And I think the words that you said about long-termism are absolutely what we believe. We know that we need to transform our balance sheet. We've got some interim targets out there of converting sort of 50% of the balance sheet in terms of its carbon impact. So basically that's for the loans that we make to people to make sure that they are being invested and used to develop initiatives. I mean, there's so many different things that people do that have 50% less of a carbon impact. You know, that for us, it makes good economic sense. It's good for society. It's the right thing to do. So it's a very logical thing to do. But it's a hard thing to do in terms of actually making sure that you're able to work with the myriad of different industries to kind of help them work through how they can change the way that they run their businesses, the way that they do their operations, to the kind of investment that they need within their day-to-day kind of experience to actually then measure. And a huge part of it is measurement to say, well, I started, you know, with X, you know, tons of extracted CO2 to get to Y. That's a completely different language for everybody. So it is hard work. I think some of the things that we also thought we had to do first was to get our own house in order. So we kind of did a baseline study, and I think the studies are really important. And I almost don't care what the answer is of the study. It's like, do the study, get a number, you'll get better and the number will improve. And we know that from that study that we did, that we've kind of reduced 46% of the carbon that we emit from our organisation through these buildings and the way that we work since 2019. So a great step forward. There is more to do. And that was really important for us to kind of then get to the point that when you're sitting out talking with customers, you also have some credibility that you've been through the pain of that piece. Clearly, it's very different if you're a big manufacturing company to a bank, because some of our issues in terms of what we have to convert is different. And then we published our climate transition plan, which we published in February, which was where me and my team played a huge amount of work. Now, the climate transition plan kind of talks about where we're going on our SBTi targets. What's really important there, though, is I'm a finance professional, I produce annual reports with ease, but you need real content. So you need to know that it is something that is really embedded in the bank and is really working, or else those plans, actually, they're just not credible in terms of where we're going. So we were very excited to do our publication of that this year, and we'll continue to build on that as we go through the following years. But it is about making sure that it's in the organisation. And what I don't want is the ESG team from one bit of the building to come and talk to me. When I get a proposal for something, I want them to think that they've thought about the carbon impacts of it, the ESG impacts of it, and that we actually track and monitor what happens on a, not quite monthly, because we're not quite quick enough on that yet, but on a quarterly kind of basis, so you can see the progress that we're making. And I do think it is about that real embedded in the organisation. It can't be a separate team that's sitting at the edge of things, so that we can then really get to the point of kind of working with our customers so that they can reduce their impact the same way that we're starting to reduce our own.
And so you talked about working with customers, which is a very nuanced approach. So there's a lot of pressure, perhaps from the media, to say, well, actually, don't work with certain customers. Let's just cut them and choose to sever your ties with them. So how does NatWest Group think about that? So are there certain industries that are, I think, just difficult to engage with, and maybe your resources best spent just severing ties? And how do you decide which are the industries that are ones that you can work with and engage with?
I think the really important thing for us in NatWest is the word transition. In terms of it, we really do recognise that it's easy, and it's an easier public statement to say, no, we're stopping that now. But actually, I think my own kind of personal feeling, if you just do the hard stop what happens is it moves off very public balance sheets to very private balance sheets, and actually you can no longer see what's there. So we really do believe in the whole kind of transition piece. One of the probably the best examples of where we've done a lot of work was in the oil and gas industry. And what we had said back in 2021 was that if you didn't have a credible transition plan, that we were no longer going to fund new investments. Now, what was quite interesting in that is that some companies said, that's fine, I'm not interested, we'll go somewhere else for my funding, that's fine, that's a kind of a commercial decision for us to make. And for others, it was to really work with them. Now, if I go back to 2021, and it seems silly to say this in 2023, I don't think we really knew what a credible transition plan was, and the team would assess them kind of qualitatively and quantitatively. So I would say there wasn't a kind of question of, well, that plan's not good enough for 2021, you're gone. It's kind of like, how do we work together? What's the intention? And what's been really clear for us, the same way that NatWest wanted to make this change, so do all the companies that we work with, and there's real fantastic examples of people who've kind of gone through that. And as their maths has got better and our maths has got better, it's a bit more quantitative than it was at the beginning, where it was very qualitative, and my relationship managers out in the field would say, okay, you're making me fill in these enormous data things, and it's all very complicated. And you think as a bank, one of the important things when we assess any loan, we do a huge amount of credit risk assessment, and a lot of this kind of physical risk type stuff, a lot of it's there anyway. So it's kind of how do you pull it together so that you can really work with companies. So it's a very much a collaborative thing that we do with the company. And then, loans, as you all know, they come up for renewal in something like 3 years, and then there's, I think, a stickier conversation the second time round when you go, right, guys, you said you do this. Some of them will have absolutely blown the socks off it and gone much further, and others might be struggling. Why are you struggling? How can we help? What should we be looking at? And I do think it is about that partnership piece, so that they can meet their aims and we can also meet ours.
Thanks very much, Katie. Can I just turn the question to you, Steve? So we'll broaden the conversation beyond oil and gas later, but I'm sure this is a key issue which is on the minds of many of our audience. So what is Aegon Asset Management's position on fossil fuels? Is it something you divest from or engage in, or how do you approach this?
Our overall sort of stance is one of excluding the very worst. And there are some, clear bad practices and disruptive extraction techniques in oil and gas, and indeed around coal and fossil fuel, that you just don't want to go towards and sponsor. So that exclusion principle for the very worst is something that is embedded in our policies in certain areas of the business, but also in our thinking. But you don't have the luxury just to stop everything, as Kate was saying. This has got to be a transition, and therefore where we do own fossil fuel companies, and this is in public markets, so they are generally high quality, large operations that are themselves engaged in transitioning and thinking about their business, then we absolutely want to engage and help with that. And we do that through the ownership of equity and the rights that infers to people, and we make sure we use them effectively. And it is a conversation that is looking for not only short-term sort of resolution type issues, but ongoing constant change. So continual improvement, I think, is something that is very important in this area. And the pace needed for delivering that continual improvement is absolutely picking up. And I think you'll see that in the amount of attention and engagement that the investment industry overall is giving on this, and in turn that we are getting from our end customers. We are very often an intermediary here between the gauge and views of our end investors, our pension fund customers, our fund unit holders, and what they would like to see in the businesses that they are the ultimate owners of. So there's an increased sort of appetite for our action to reflect end customer activity. The other thing I would say is that the power of getting certainly fossil fuel and just net zero agendas on company priority lists is very much driven by some of the initiatives globally. So the Net Zero Asset Owner initiative, where it's come under some pressure recently, certainly from issues in the States, but is a well-supported view that asset owners will transition towards net zero by 2050 and in their own portfolios. And alongside that, the Net Zero Asset Manager initiative is something about increasing the amount of net zero fit for delivery investments we have overall in our activities. And the proportion of assets that we manage will need to go up that match those net zero criteria going forward. So it's our own thinking. It's working with customers, absolutely, but also it's some of the broader-based industry initiatives which have come under some pressure recently, but I still think absolutely have real traction and efficacy to get to deliver what we have signed up to as societies within the COP process and the Paris Agreement. And indeed, the issue is maybe not about the ultimate target, but about the pace we are getting there now. And we have to drive for continual increasing improvement of those goals.
And Steve, you mentioned pressure from the US, and so one pressure, and I'll caricature here their argument, is you have one fiduciary duty they'll claim, which is long-term returns to investors, and sometimes divestment or engagement could sacrifice those returns, because if you view climate as an unpriced externality, it's true that companies could just get away with polluting as much as possible, and if you're to move them away from that, then you're going to sacrifice financial returns. So how do you see, is there any conflict with fiduciary duty, or are they just misrepresenting what duty involves?
I think there's a lot of manipulation and selective argument proponents around the fiduciary duty issue. We are a regulated industry. We have prospectuses setting out what assets can and shouldn't do. We have a requirement to absolutely be true to, the characteristics that you set out for the original strategy and to deliver that. And therefore, there is no conflict with that mandate level fiduciary duty. And I think that's one of the nuances and detail that people miss. It is not everybody's view that you just need to maximize profit, full stop. There is a growing, and should be absolutely highlighted, explicit set of products, whether passive or active, whether focused around thematic and impact activity that can be enhanced with investment and capital provision to it, or just general sort of participation in the carbon transition that is available to customers, and that, as an asset manager, we are very keen to promote and provide to allow people to absolutely engage in the most appropriate products for them that meet their views, and we believe over time that sort of specific mandate around ESG alongside good returns will absolutely take the majority of finance going forward as the transition goes on. The debate around, a particular aspect of fiduciary duty, I do think misses the point. You want to be a responsible long-term investor in the round. That very much is about, yes, a good financial return, but one that is sustainable, predictable, and is not going to get caught out by the very significant changes that are taking place around us in the environment or in society or around governance requirements.
And so, Katie, could I turn a similar question to you? So my opening question to you was, what risk does climate pose to the balance sheet? But is it that NatWest will also try to address risk to society? So even if something wasn't feeding through to long-term returns, do NatWest view that you have a social obligation to address issues such as climate change and biodiversity and so on? And if so, where do you draw the line? Or is it always that it has to be a long-term risk to your balance sheet for you to take action?
So look, I think there's a blend in all of these things. It's too simplistic to say, well, the numbers say this, so therefore we'll make a decision. We have to look at what it means for our customers, what it means for their communities and what it means for their employees. We've done a lot of work with a group called for Better Business. Yeah. And we have a kind of scorecard that kind of works through, as you look through each of the kind of community different and customers and our staff kind of different areas, that kind of says, like, think about these pieces. Look, I won't lie, the middle section's the numbers. I'm the finance person, I probably look at the middle section first, and then I remind myself to look at the other sections to kind of make sure it's there. But that's been really important. I think, though, what's really important is we're not the kind of arbiter on these things. We need to make sure that we do look at it in the round. Is there progress? I think that transition piece is really important. I also do, really believe that ultimately, there's a balance sheet lens, and actually in the short term, if I look at things like our green mortgages, we do them at slightly lower costs, so therefore slightly less profits. I'm talking a basis point or two. It doesn't move the dial particularly, but actually there can be a bit more of a cost at the beginning to making sure that you're either offering the right product or the investment we need to make within the firm. I chair a group which is called our Climate Transition Group, it's a Climate Infrastructure Transition Group. It's basically the plumbing. So actually, how do we plumb the organisation that I can report as effectively on carbon as I do on the capital usage that we have? Now, that is a huge investment for us as an organisation. Doesn't help any of our particular transactions. We absolutely see it as an investment in the future. So therefore you kind of have to lay those things down. So I do think as you do a lot of the climate transition, it is about what will come later. And actually in the earlier stage, it can have a cost. But if I am to be, and we are to be a long-term sustainable company, we know we have to change that balance sheet. We have to have the ability to assess the risks, looking through them at different lens, or else we will underwrite risks that we don't understand. And actually that ultimately will become a negative. So it's incredibly symbiotic in terms of the balance. Yeah. But we do, if we think of our purpose, it is around helping our customers, communities and businesses to thrive. This is something that will ultimately help make them thrive. And we know what's good for society is good for the banks. So there's just a huge connectivity in what we try to do in that space.
We could probably have the whole panel or the whole conference about climate, but sadly there's so many other problems in the world to address. So Steve, could I move beyond climate, but still focus on the environment to another key emerging environmental issue, which is biodiversity. So how have Aegon started to think about it? Because it's more complex in that with climate you can put everything into at least a CO2 equivalent, whereas one species is not the same as another species. So how do you come up with a broad framework to address these risks?
I think you highlight the issues well in the question, saying that this is a complex, multi-dimensional area that, frankly, there is no overall agreed approach to, and indeed where the data that allows you to perhaps come up with consistent conclusions is very spotty indeed. Now, it reminds us that in the investment teams of where sort of carbon assessment and intensity and some of the climate and CO2 emission data was about 10 years ago. And so there is a lot of work to do to come up with what will be reasonable data sets that are, relevant for certain industries, whether it's high biodiversity impact around land use, around agriculture, around infrastructure and mining extraction, and seeing those things properly registered and thought about, relative to, maybe an excess burden to a company you invest in, which is not having any of those impacts as a recruitment consultancy. So I think there is a patch of ground here to really be sort of mapped out and thought about. And this is not just an excuse from an asset manager struggling with data and outcomes. We have only just seen this week, actually, the task force on nature-related financial disclosures, come out with at least a framework that will enhance the industry's overall approach. And there are various other approaches to that, especially in Europe around SFDR and the consideration of adverse impacts in investment thinking that include biodiversity risk and what we need to do. So hugely important, certainly for some sectors where there is absolute crucial impact, maybe not for all. And we have to work out over the next 2 years, I suspect, how we make credible use of this and put it to work. One thing I would say, though, is that, again, and it plays a bit to what you were saying in the introduction, Alex, you can spotlight any one particular area and perhaps overemphasize that. This is about responsible investing rather than necessarily ESG or biodiversity focused or activity. And it is judgments and activity around the business as a whole and the attitude of management and the progress it's making towards addressing those issues. And that is where you get confidence to allocate capital and to continue to support and participate in a good business. I sometimes think point focus is missing that overall assessment process. And indeed, as an asset manager, you can create different products that can emphasize the degree of responsible focus that you want to see in the pool of assets that you've got. And that's part of our duty to offer choice and educate people in the broader marketplace.
And one could argue that this is not just responsible investing, this is investing. So this is a point that Leon, who's one of the latest speakers, has highlighted. This is just taking into account material risks and opportunities is the duty of any investor. And so in case this conversation gets too depressing, right, all of these environmental risks and we can't even measure them, let's turn it to a bit more positive. So businesses can not only avoid doing harm and address serious issues, but they can actively do good and contribute towards the betterment of society. And one way in which NatWest has tried to focus on this is, as one of your 3 pillars, is enterprise. And so why did you choose that pillar when there's many other problems in the world or many other things that you could prioritize? And then how are you putting that into practice in your actions?
So I think it's very important when you're trying to advance things is that you pick something that's part of your own DNA. So, I mean, in terms of, as a bank, clearly the kind of building of businesses is something that we've supported, for close to sort of 300 years from when the Royal Bank of Scotland started here up in Scotland. So, I mean, I think, so it is making sure that we use the skills and the deep knowledge that we have in our own financial system. We're the biggest supplier of financing into companies in the UK. So we get to see just so much in different kind of ways. And we see companies that over the years have done well and others that have struggled. And actually what we wanted to do was to actually say, how could we remove some of the barriers to enterprise with a really strong focus on those groups that are underrepresented and at the same time kind of tackling some of the inequality that we see in enterprise. It's lovely to be in a room like this that is so sort of sexually diverse in terms of male and female. I spend a huge amount of my time in rooms that are all men in black suits, often in the investor community, it must be said, Stephen, in terms of that space. So, I mean, and I think one of the things we really sort of said, like, why is that? Why is it so difficult for businesses to kind of get up and get running? And so we did a lot of work looking at what we had learned and in our time, and we sort of put out these kind of aims. So this year, we've got an aim that we are helping 35,000 individuals or businesses through 275,000 interventions. That's kind of interesting, but just kind of it's the data to prove that we've actually kind of done something. But of those businesses that we're working with, we said 50% of them need to be female, 20% of them need to be ethnic minority, and 75% of them need to be regional. So not just here in Edinburgh, where we're very strong, or in London in the southeast, again, where we're very strong, but actually to make sure that there's real kind of diversity across the piece. We've done a huge amount of work on female entrepreneurship. One of the things that we're most proud of is the Rose Report, which Alison, our previous CEO, sponsored, really highlighting how hard it was for female businesses to get started and some of those barriers, whether it was access to venture capital funds or just actually mental barriers about taking on debt, and really kind of pushing that forward. And we've done, as part of our work on female entrepreneurship, we now have sort of 200 different signatories on a code of business which is around investing in women to make sure that businesses will invest in female-led businesses. And that is has created really strong benefits in that business. And I get to mentor quite a few of those entrepreneur ladies. They always put me a little bit to shame in terms of what they're trying to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And I know the programs we've done with them have just helped enormously. We also are working with kind of 50,000 young people to kind of help them to get into enterprise and entrepreneurial activity. what's really interesting is I think that the mindset of the young is much more entrepreneurial than I was young. I always hate it when I hear myself say that. But, you know, my 12-year-old daughter talks about the business that she will run. You know, she already sells her crochet. I'll take orders after the event. She does a very cool headband sort of thing. But in terms of that, and it's interesting that young people think much more in that way than I ever did and my peers. So actually, how do we really help them kind of garnish that? We do a lot of work with Mentor, you know, mentoring Scottish women in business here. And also, one of the things that you get to do as the group CFO is you get to turn up at the London Stock Exchange occasionally and ring the bell when you've issued some nice bond, which actually other people have done most of the work for. And recently we issued a really important social bond, and the bond was purely issued to invest in female-led businesses. And I think through that kind of enterprise piece, we can kind of go like, we know that we're the biggest bank in the country. We know that we can do real good, but actually how do we make sure that we lift everybody up and across at the same time, whether it's through the programs that we run, the business accelerators that we run, and making sure that we've got the right diversity. So it's not just, it's not easy for any entrepreneur. I have endless respect for them, but for some it is a bit easier than for others. So make sure that we pull everyone along, because we know a little bit like your M-Pesa example, the fact that it was more women that was using it, actually it created a better outcome for society as well. So it's something that we're really proud of, and I think Alison, through the Alison Rose report, I mean, was absolutely groundbreaking in terms of taking that forward.
All of the answers you've given me, Katie, are based on sound business logic. So you've said these things are good for society, but they're also good for business. Right? If we're managing climate risk, this is good. If we're also just extending our customer base to women minorities. So given that the title of this is the challenges of ESG integration, I know that we're sort of preaching to the converted here. Everybody in this room would see there's lots of business logic behind both those pillars. But what are the main pushbacks that you get from either other people internally or from shareholders? Are there people who say, oh, I actually think this might be at the expense of returns, or have they been easy to bring along on your journey?
So I don't think they've been easy to bring along. In some way, actually, the entrepreneurship one was probably the easiest because it's so entangled with what you do as a bank. You do lend, you provide credit facilities. You know, actually, how can you expand the scope of people that you do that for? I mean, there's a kind of a no-brainer. I think for me, if I look at the climate piece without kind of taking us back there, there's an understanding and acceptance. For us, what has been interesting is that we are now part of different globally managed funds because of the way we as a bank are recognised. So therefore, it's brought new investors into our organisation. Interestingly, when I do things like issue the social bond and the team pull that together, we bring in different debt investors as well. And actually, our coupons are sometimes slightly tighter. So people can go, I see why that makes sense. So therefore, Stephen and his other investment pools will go take that kind of works. I do think that what I'm seeing from investors is the far more maturity in answering the ESG question. So historically, if I go back, I mean, not so long, but 4 or 5 years, when I would go to investor meetings, which I do sort of 100 plus in any one year, sometimes what would happen is the investor would go, oh, I've got a question. And they'd read me this question out and they go, this came from my ESG team. And I would give them the answer. And I would know what question 2, 3, and 4 should be on the answer that I've just given them. And I wouldn't get question 2, 3, and 4. And I think what's been quite interesting is now I almost never go to a meeting where there's not an ESG investor in that room who is also clearly making an assessment as part of their model in terms of actually, is this a business that is truly long-term? So I think your comments about Friedman were really important. This is about making sure that we're almost 300 years old. How do we make sure we're 400 years old? And actually, that's about the true long-term delivery of it. So that has been a real kind of change. And I know when I talk to investors, the quality of the questioning has improved, and I'm also being assessed not just on climate, on the E, the S, and the G, very importantly as well.
So Steve, sticking with S, one important S issue for not just Aegon, but you personally, and it has been throughout your careers, is social mobility. So why is that such an important issue to you, and then how does Aegon put that into practice?
Well, this happened a while ago in that as a recent graduate, I was asked, and joiner of a firm, I was asked to interview and assess the next round of graduates coming into the firm. And I remember sitting in a room and being told about the characteristics of the people that we were looking for. And it suddenly twigged to me that I wouldn't have got in, given this new enhanced set of criteria into this firm, and that therefore that can't be right. So there's something in the background of me that says, hang on a minute here, we've got to challenge that sort of daftness, frankly, and almost arrogance about the characteristics of people that anybody would want in their business, because whilst this is a finance conference, everything we're talking about is people-based. And, they have and do come in many, many different shapes and forms with absolute different characteristics and some different drivers. And enhancing all of that and capturing all of that in diverse teams, academic studies, business delivery, and indeed culture in organizations and longevity in firms absolutely benefits from all of that. So I've taken, whenever I can, the opportunity to sponsor and force an open mind into an environment which has very often got quite a lot of subconscious bias within it. So I think that's what has been important for me. What can you do about it? Well, we don't have the scale of NatWest Group, and it's fantastic to hear, that bigger companies are doing things in scale and pushing things out. For our part, I would shout out the Investment Association's Investment 2020 program, which is taking school leavers, might not have the background or the wherewithal to think about university, but gives them a year's worth of pretty structured and great work experience in investment management. And quite a lot of those decide not to go to university, but to continue their careers as school leavers and make great contributions to investment management businesses, not just as investors, but as marketers, as salespeople, as people involved in operations and IT and tech and everything we can offer there. And then, talk a lot about the education that's needed. So it's a program called Red Start that goes into schools and educates pretty young children about the very basics of finance. And coming into that question about, too many old white men in suits in investment management, then a couple of programs, one of which is Future Asset for teenage girls, gives them some work experience in investment management early on, which is great. Girls as Investors is another university intern type program. Broadening the net across the many talents that are available, then say the great work that Black Professional Scotland has been doing in this locality and in the city. We've been very, very happy to sponsor that and support it as best we can. So it's an attitude, it's addressing unconscious bias, and then it's doing what you can across a range of channels to try and get the best talent into the organization and create the right culture.
And what Steve's just shared seems to be linked to NatWest's third key pillar, which is learning. So Katie, could you talk about what NatWest is doing and why, again, that you chose this to be a priority?
Yeah, so learning, again, it's something that we focus because it makes good financial sense for us as well. One of the things on learning is as you look at the financial skills, and you'll all have read these reports, but the financial skills within any country and the financial literacy, the average age is that of an 11-year-old in terms of their financial skills. And it's one of the things, clearly I'm very numerate, and what amazes me is in terms of even just my own siblings, that they come and they go, I've got to fill in this mortgage form, I don't understand it. And you think to yourself, how is that possible? So one of the things that we've done is we bank 19 million people in the UK. So it's practically kind of one in three people have a relationship with the bank. And what's become incredibly clear is the kind of lack of financial knowledge that so many of them have. So a few things that we've been really pushing on, which again make good financial sense for us, but are really important for them as individuals, is one of the key things is to help 2 million people to save. So the number of people in the UK that have never saved anything in their life, their parents didn't save, they have nothing behind them. And so what we said was, let's help you get to that first £100 of savings. And the reality is once you've started to save, your propensity to continue to save is enormously increased. But if you've never started, then the actual beginning of it is really, really difficult. So that's one of the things, and we're well on the way on that target. Now, £100 is not going to save the problem, but it might help you in a moment of stickiness. And actually, the reality is what we can see is as people kind of go further. We've also tried to work on how do we get people to improve their financial capability and their understanding, and really investing in this. One of the key things that you see on our app is around know your own credit score. Now you will all know how to find your credit score out. What's interesting is the number of people that pay each month to kind of get their credit score told to them from different bureaus, and they're like, we'll give it to you for free. And then what we can see is that people who are actively applying for a loan, they'll go back to their know their own credit score piece on the app. They'll change some parameters and say, well, what if I did this? What if I did that? What would it do to my score? Could I borrow more? Should I borrow less? And actually, people are starting to think about those implications of it in a way that's very easy for them to access. You know, and people don't like talking about money. It's one of the kind of remaining taboos that we still have in this country and globally, that people just don't talk about money because I don't want to be embarrassed that I've got more or you've got less, or that I spent money here and I should have spent money there and I've got a problem. It's something that's really difficult. So one of the things about a lot of the stuff that we can build is actually, I don't need you to talk about it, but there are tools that you can use and are really accessible. We do a program and have been doing it's called Money Sense. We've been doing it within schools within the UK for sort of 40 or 50 years. It's now part of the school curriculum. So 60% of children will go through this kind of Money Sense program. You know, it doesn't change their financial future, but it gives them a few words that they understand, and they understand a little bit more what is a credit card, what's this, what's that. And I think that's really important. But things also evolve. And I think one of the things that we've got more that we're involved in just now is an issue with Marcus Rashford. So for those of you who don't follow your football, he's a very well-known young footballer, very, very successful, came from a very disadvantaged background, and he came to us and said, I want to work with a program with you that I can work on how do I help people thrive in terms of their financial futures, because it's what he had seen his family struggle with the most, and now he has huge personal wealth because of his footballing credentials. But actually, how do I get the local youth clubs to actually run classes and things like that? So that's for us, for why learning was so important. Again, it's intrinsically linked. If I have people that can manage their financial situation much better, they'll take different financial decisions. That will ultimately help us as well. But also, we just know it will also help and lift society as well, which is why for us it was a really kind of important last learning. And to see those people that have never saved have a little bit of cushion behind them, I mean, it's a very satisfying thing to be involved in.
Well, there's many more questions I'd love to ask you both, but if my maths serves me correctly, there's 34 other speakers to get through today. So let me hand back to Vanessa to start introducing some of them. But before I do that, let's give a bigger round of applause to Stephen and Katie.